Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the panel regarding terror noir with readers Khachikian. My name is Ehsan Khoshbakht. I'm the co-curator of this tribute to one of Iranian cinema's greatest, Khachikian, and we're hoping to contextualize the 4 films which we will be screening during the next few days, and to encourage you actually to go and see more of these very, very rare films, and hopefully we can give you a bit of information on the filmmaker. If it was a panel about Fellini, it would have been very easy. Everybody knows about Fellini, and you pick a specific angle when you talk about it. But here it's going to be lots of ABC, for which I should apologize in advance. But I think a bit of information, the basic information on Khachikian and Iranian cinema of the 50s and 60s and genre films is absolutely essential in order to give a better understanding of how and why these films were made and how they were received. Please allow me to introduce the guests. We have a very, very interesting bunch of Iranians here. From my left, Mania Gregorian. Mania is actually working on lots of fascinating restoration projects in Bologna. She works for the labs in Bologna. She's Armenian Iranian, so hopefully she can tell us a lot about the Armenian Iranian angle. And those of you who've been to the Boston Keaton project, the Keaton project is one of Mania's current restoration projects. And then from Tehran, we have Behdad Amini. Behdad is a filmmaker. He also writes about Iranian cinema, and he's a huge fan of Khachikian. He's also the co-curator of Terror Noir. And then we have Kave Askari, who an Iranian American, and Kave is the author of Making Movies into Art, Picture Craft from the Magic Lantern to Early Hollywood. It's a book on early cinema published by the British Film Institute. And Kave was absolutely instrumental in making this project happen. And I should thank him, and also the Northwestern University in Qatar, which provided me with some fund for the research and subtitling of the films. I hope the reason Saudi Arabia has cut ties with Qatar is not because of supporting the Khachikian thing, but because the university is no more. Within 2 weeks, it's a crazy word, isn't it? And finally, Sarah Ehsan Bakhtiari, who is in the projection booth, and she helped us. She's from Birkbeck College in London. She helped us with translating the films into Italian and organizing this panel. So, how about starting with some general remarks about Khachikian? I'm not going to say much because, well, you already have the catalog. If you don't have the catalog, you have there's an online article on the Sight and Sound website, which contains information about Khachikian's background, his films, and his career. So you can just Google it and find it. It's called Terror Noir. So, those of you who have seen the only film we have screened so far, Anxiety, made in 1962, have realized that we are talking about a director who is self-taught, who is Armenian-Iranian, from a family of refugees, born in Tabriz, who is a genius in creating something interesting in almost every single shot, introducing something new in almost every single shot. And because of that, his films always convey this deep passion for cinema because he's a man who's thinking cinema all the time. Even if there are clumsy moments, bad acting, whatever. You are talking about a man who was making films with nothing. So comparing the budget with which these films were produced, you're talking about a man who was making B movies, or even less than that, still with a camera which he couldn't operate more than 25 seconds because the engine of the camera, the motor was catching fire. That's why his films have this incredible pace, because 25 seconds, Persian is a very slow language, and he was not satisfied with it. He considered Persian sluggish. That's why he was shooting some of the dialogue scenes at 22 frames per second. So give them a better pace. He was obsessed with the pace because he also liked music and he knew music, and he loved genre films. He was dubbed as Iranian Hitchcock. He hated it, understandably so, because well, there are more similarities between him and some German directors that he admired than Hitchcock, and I think that comparison eventually didn't do him much good. Let us start with Mania and the question of Armenian Iranians in Iranian cinema as the fathering figures of Iranian cinema. What brought them there? What were the pros and cons of being non-Muslim and being into art in a country in which the majority of people were Muslims, but they were producing entertainment for millions. So you can start from whatever you like, whatever angle you prefer.
Hello, everyone. I'm actually going to start more back in the history how Armenians ended up there, because most of the times that is the question. Being the biggest linguistical and religious minority in Iran, still existing today. So basically the question is always, how did they end up there? Basically, Armenians have always been the native inhabitants of the northwestern region of Iran, and very back in the history they were also Zoroastrians, so they were basically the same, as there were cultural and ritual exchange between them. In 301 they accept Christianity as their official language, official religion, and that is when things start changing and they start to kind of shape their own identity. In 405, they introduced the Armenian alphabet, which is very important in Armenian culture because they are very much identified with themselves, with the language, and it's a very important aspect of it because most of the time they are grown up first speaking Armenian and tied to their identity through that. Having said that they've always been there, there are also some dates that they're forced to immigrate to much more inner regions of Iran. One of the most important is that in the 17th century there's a war, Safavid and Ottoman wars, and the Shah Abbas actually forces them to move 500,000 Armenians to the inner region, to the Esfahan. Not so many people survive, but who survives actually, they base a city called New Jolfa, which turns out to be a very important center culturally and for the Armenians as one of the biggest cities. So having said that, there are Christians actually helps them a lot, because in a way, when they're under the mercy of the governors, they actually grow and they become the bridge of connecting the Western world to Iran. They become merchants, they are craftsmen, they bring the technologies, they travel, they don't have much difference with the Western world, so they're much more open, and they embrace the Western technologies and also the thoughts. Of course, they go through some time periods where they're repressed and they're not allowed to do much, but when they can, they actually start to build schools, they start to build churches, And that's how they always keep their identity through their languages. And it's very important to their growth and how the people are shaped in the society. Having said that, there is also the date of the genocide that Khachikian's family actually is a survivor of that. Although the people who managed to survive after the First World War's genocide don't end up really in Iran, they go towards the more western parts, the Western Europe or Syria or Beirut. But however, some of them end up, which Khachikian family is one of them. During the 20th century modernization of Iran, they play a very important political and cultural role in Iran during the Reza Shah and his son. They, as I said, they bring a lot of technologies, and they're very important with the novelties, the new things. Having said all these historical things, I'm going to go through the history of cinema, how they play the role of the pioneers. So cinema and photography actually come to Iran pretty early with Nasruddin Shah and Mozaffar Shah. When they come to Europe and during their travel, they discover this new technology and they're very fascinated with that. So they buy some, they take it, and actually they themselves are engaged in producing photographies and producing films. So it arrives pretty early, and since they are really keen onto that, it kind of opens the way for screenings also for the public, even if in a very smaller scale. But there are some theaters, home theaters that are built, and Armenians are part of those pioneers who built this very small cinemas, and they've shown the imported newsreel mostly, so it's spread that way. We arrived to like the Second World War. The production of cinemas kind of comes to a halt. Nothing is really produced, and so everything is kind of. Sorry, I'm just going to go back. I missed the point. So cinema stays in that primitive state, I would say, till 1925, 1930. There's not much production, it's mostly documentaries. There is an Armenian, again, Iranian figure called Ovanes Oganyan, which actually happens to really change the scene to that. He was born in Iran, he moves around, he goes to Russia, he studies there, and in 1925 he comes back to Iran with his daughter. Till that point, we don't have any cinema industry, and he realizes that there is a need to produce films actually. So in order to do that, he founds a school. He calls it cinema artistic school, and he starts to train people. He starts to train actors. He starts to train cinematographers, who are going to help him to produce the first movie, the first feature-length movie in 1930, which is called Abi and Rabi, which was lost unfortunately in a fire. Then he goes on to produce the second movie, which is still existing today, and I really hope that one day we are going to screen it here. Hope that. So he plays this very, very important role of industrializing. Sorry, my English is not helping me. With introducing the cinema as an industry. From that on, people of course go on and develop the sound movies and their import equipment and films start to produce. We come to the Second World War, we don't have much production. Then we get to like in 40s and 50s, which they start to found new production houses. And again, in this field, there are some Armenians who start building these production houses. One of them is Diana, which happens to be very important. The founder of Diana production house sees Khachikian, who by this time has already moved to Tehran, because Khachikian was born in Tabriz, that city in northwest of Iran to an Armenian family. He was raised there, but they had to they had to flee again the war and move to Tehran during the Second World War. So he's relocated in Tehran at some point in his life. He starts early writing poetry and gets them published in the Armenian newspaper, which is called Anik, and it's still in production today. And he starts writing plays, and as I said earlier, whenever they have time, they build these Armenian clubs and cultural clubs and theaters and schools. So he starts his career there. He writes plays, and some of his colleagues, they put it on stage. Khachikian, the founder of the Yana studio, sees these plays by Khachikian and invites Khachikian to the Yana studio in order to make a movie. And since there starts the collaboration, he makes his first movie, Vazgash, The Return. After that, shortly after that, he adapts his own first play, one of his first plays, into a movie called A Girl from Shiraz, which is actually very important because Khachikian makes the very first trailer ever made in Iran for that movie. And I'm going to stop here.
Okay. Thank you so much. So, yeah, now imagine you're in the 50s. Okay, he has made The Return, and we're about to move on to the next one, which is The Crossroad of Events, playing today at 4:15. But thinking about the 50s in Iran, the country holds a very unique position, film culture-wise. It's an exceptional place on the planet because it's probably the only place in which you could see all the American films, all the French films, all the Italian films, plus Egyptian, Hindi, and Turkish films. No other country in Europe probably you could see some European and American films, but never Turkish or Egyptian films. So, and I'm not talking about the film club scene, I'm talking about the mainstream culture, the mainstream cinemas of Iran, which were playing all different sorts of films. And the country, this kind of the cinephilic atmosphere of Iran in the 50s and 60s, I believe, to have a strong influence on Khachikian and generations after him. So I'm going to ask Kave about the 50s and the film culture scene in Iran, and because it's also part of his ongoing research. Kave?
Okay, sure. In the interest of time, I have a couple of slides, but I won't dwell on them. I just wanted to give a little bit of sense of this context, and I think really setting up that distinction as you did between the film club scene, reviewing many different kinds of films, and the local sort of everyday movie-going culture reviewing many different kinds of films is a really good distinction to make, because you have that kind of attention to film history and the diversity of film history on the level of just sort of everyone who goes to buy a ticket, right? And I guess what I wanted to say is to set up a little bit of context for distinguishing the Iranian film scene and film industry in the mid-century from other kind of regional centers, right? And you think of two points that are pretty prominent that are nearby. There's a film industry in India and the film industry in Egypt, which are both, relatively speaking, closed off to the kind of circulation of foreign films that we see in Iran. You know, India has its own robust industry that to a large degree, relatively keeps out other productions, and Egypt has a lot of protections against, you know, a certain number of films that can be dubbed every year. Even American-owned, Hollywood-owned cinema houses like Metro cinemas. You know, there were huge points of contention where you know, they sort of wrestled with regulations of having to show a certain number of local productions in addition to the productions that they're getting from their main distributors at home. And those kinds of restrictions are not as established in Iran, and you get this kind of this much wilder circulation of these films in that industry, right at the time when the local film industry is emerging, and the filmmakers are kind of industrializing in the mid-century and the post-war period. And I guess what I wanted to say about it is that, you know, if you talk about influence of Hollywood or circulation of Hollywood in Iran, what is maybe another really important point of distinction here is that circulation, that sort of intense circulation of Hollywood films in Iran in the middle of the century does not come along with a increased level of sort of surveillance or oversight by these distributors, right? Even in Cairo, right, where you have a lot of Hollywood films playing on screen, you have the main office distributors. They're absolutely aware of all of the box office, all of the seats that are sold, and they have the prints are returned, or all the prints are accounted for. By the time these prints reach Iranian screens, they are out of sight of the local, or sorry, the main office distributors. And if we could go, this is one of the main regional distributors in Baghdad. His name is Naim Izer. He was one of the main distributors in the 40s and 50s of Hollywood films into Iran. If we go a couple of slides down, I just wanted to show you one example. So these are outright sales, right? No expectation that the prints would be returned. They just sell them, outright as prints. Maybe one, two more.
Yeah, is that intentional? And as far as Staircase is the first title, because that was Ehsan Khoshbakh's favorite film.
Yeah. I included, I included that. Right, and Notorious. Right, we talked about Hitchcock. Sorry, these kids all start working. But I wanted to show you just an example of the kind of invisibility that we get in this film scene, right? You have the regional rights in the entire Middle East for all of David Selznick's films in 1952. The entire back catalog sold to a regional distributor in Cairo named George Mansour. He immediately starts complaining to the Selznick main office that these films are screening in Iran, and they're unlicensed copies, and they're eating into his profit margin. And so they launch this investigation, and they try to track the prints, right? So here we have the regional distributor in Baghdad saying, spellbound, destroyed 1945 according to instructions, and they send this affidavit that the print had been destroyed. If you could go maybe one slide further. You see, in fact, that regional distributor kept a record of every seat sold in 1949, and he knew very well that the print wasn't destroyed, right? And this is just one example. I mean, I have hundreds of these, right? But it gives you a sense of, okay, so we have this copy of Spellbound, it's circulating in Iran, and this is the point where the main office loses contact with it, right? And so you have this very robust film culture. The film-going population in Iran was many times out of Iraq at this time, and this is the Kingazi returns here, right? So completely invisible, but also ubiquitous. And what I think one of the consequences of that, or one of the results of that, is that you have a great degree of freedom with this material. And this material, this Hollywood material, pops up in a number of different configurations in the industry as filmmakers, dubbers, studios start to industrialize in Iran in the middle of the century. And Khachikian is a director, you talked about him being self-taught, right? And he's self-taught in this context, right? In this context of this kind of robust circulation where you can take pieces of soundtracks and reassemble them, you can take genres and reassemble them, you can remake entire films like Gilda, remade into Midnight Cry, it's a process that wouldn't be possible in the same way were these prints visible to the outside supposed owners of the rights of the films. And I just wanted to maybe end by returning to one point that Ehsan made in his Sight and Sound article about Khachikian. He talks about this sort of tension in debates about him, whether he is an imitator or innovator, I think was the phrase you used, right? And so how he's sort of using and recycling these sort of tropes, and how that sort of marks him as a director. And I thought, maybe another term that we might use to sort of think about his authorship as a filmmaker is to think of him as an assembler, right? As somebody who's part of his creative agency as a director is sort of the way that he works with this material in this kind of context of very robust circulation of films. And we can talk about that in a lot of different ways, the design of sets, we can talk about the lighting, we can talk about camera movement, a number of different things. But I think one of the sort of most obvious examples of the assemblage and how assemblage can create his identity as an author, as a creator in this period is the soundtracks of his films. I'll just end here. I mean, I've been going through soundtracks of films made in Iran in the middle of the century for the past couple of years and trying to recognize all the sources for these soundtracks. I've located about 100 of them so far. I just made a short, it's not really a clip, it's more slides that are sort of animated just so you can see. But these are just a few examples from films by Khachikian that use soundtracks from well-known Hollywood films or soundtracks associated with directors who have a particular sort of brand connected with their work. So I'll just, maybe we'll just end with those and I'll pass the mic over. So that's Spellbound.
When I started my first film club, I was 16, and there was this guy whose job before the revolution was to, they call it in Persian, axing, tabarika, axing the print, which means you go in front of the representative of the company or the studio, you open the can with an axe, you just make one hit, and the print won't be projectable afterwards. But what this guy was doing was going into the office the night before, sneaking in, changing the prints of, let's say, Johnny Guitar with a bad film, an Iranian film that he didn't like, taking the Johnny Guitar for himself and putting an Iranian film, so they were not checking every frame of the film, they were just, okay, open the can, bang, and next one. And that's how many films survived, and that's how we could show these films. I'm talking about Ahmad, he was a mutual friend, and died recently. And that's how he could start his own cinematheque, underground cinematheque, with hundreds, maybe even thousands of film copies. But that's another story. So we are in the 50s now. Khachikian makes his major breakthrough, which is Crossroads of Events, or Crossroad of Events, Chara Hawades. Now I pass the mic to Behdad to tell us a bit about how and under which circumstances these films, the classic Khachikian films were made. I call it the classic period, the period between 1955, roughly 1955 to 1965, because sounds own favorite films were made during this period. And the 4 films we're showing in Cinema Ritrovato were Sam Khachikian's favorite films as well. So, starting with Chara, is better?
Chara,
yeah.
Hello. At first, I want to mention that when the Iranian cinema industry started to work, it was nearly 50 years after the birth of cinema. So we were somehow at a delay in production films. In that time, that it was like 1984, I think, 1948. There were only few studios that started producing films. One of them was a good studio named Pars Film, but the others, like Diana, as she mentioned, and the others were small offices, small buildings with many few equipments and few experiences to make films. And Khachikian first made his first film, Return, only 4 years after cinema industry in Iran started to work. But from that first film, he was not okay with the circumstances around him. There's a story that in Return, some editor cut the film, but he was not satisfied, and he asked the producer that I want to edit myself. I did my film again. They say they didn't permit him, so at night he goes from the window to the studio and he started to re-edit all the movie, and in the morning he shows to the producers and they say, wow, it's better. So they accept his technical vision. As Ehsan said before, for his second film, Girl from Shiraz, he made first trailer for an Iranian film, and in his fourth film, A Crossroad of Events, which you can see this afternoon, he finally started to find his own style in storytelling, in photography, in editing, and everything. Crossroad of Events was a huge success. They give him the best prize for directing that year in some.
The first Iranian film festival.
First Iranian somehow festival. And so he was somehow excited to do more, and he was very ambitious. Like in those years, cinema industry was very primitive in Iran. Equipment were old, or they were primitive. They had made splicers out of wood, handmade, something like that. The cameras were not good. The negatives were old. But in that circumstance, he wanted more. He wanted to do something really impressive. He was very fond of American movies, European movies, and he thought that big screen of cinema is for big stories, as he says. And he was not satisfied with that kind of movies that they were making those days. He wanted more. So he started to experience everything, in lighting, in cinematography, editing, decoration of the sets and costumes. He gathered many talented colleagues from Armenian theatrical industry and other places, like poets, story writers, to help him. At first, everyone was said, what is he doing? We're making a film, some people go and buy a ticket, and that's all. And they can't accept him, his ambitions. But he was very jealous to do that thing. And he moved on for his, I think, fifth film, A Night in Hell, you can call it. He made some strange structure for this movie. It's some kind of variety. It's comedy, it's fantasy, it's like melodrama. And he followed this star in his next film, The Storm in Our City, which is one of his best works, and it was a huge success. When it was shown, it was a screening in Tehran, the streets were closed for that.
Yeah, you can see a picture of that on that Sight and Sound article,
yeah.
Beautiful picture.
And after The Storm in Our City, the producers started believing him and gave him more freedom to do his work. But because the general circumstance of cinema industry in Iran was very primitive or somehow poor, he had to struggle for every little thing he wanted to do. From della, which is in 1962, he started to make a circle of, you can say, crime or mystic crime movies, and that was very well accepted by the audiences. For della and for his next movie, One Step to Death, and then another film, Zarbat, Strike that we saw that here. Again, the streets were packed with people. And newspapers were so excited, producers were so excited, and these 2 or 3 films actually create somehow a wave of crime, policier crime films in Iran. After Khachikian and along the years that he was working.
You're talking about how many films?
We can say 25, 30 films, at least, that I know, that they were making in order to repeat that success. Many directors, many actors, and many producers were tempted to make these films, and they were a huge success for quite 4 or 5 years before the new wave of Iranian cinema, which was come up with Ganjavarun, some can say light melodrama. It made another circle in movie industry in Iran.
Which was like the beginning of the end for Khachikian, the beginning of his downfall in terms of the change.
Somehow. At first he didn't believe that he's finished. He tried more. He tried 1 or 2 films after Ganjavarun, but they were not successful, so he was very disappointed, and somehow the producers and the audiences put him away.
You know what I find interesting is that last year, same venue, Ibrahim Gulistan was sitting here, and he was telling exactly the same history. And so we were talking about one of the pioneers of modern cinema in Iran, but he had to go through exactly the same process of training every single person in his crew in order to make films. He started in almost the same time, late 50s, but his first feature film was made in the mid-60s. Still in the middle of the 60s, you had to train your modernist cameraman. You had to train your modernist film composer and actor. And that's quite...
I just train your assistant director.
Yeah, right, yeah.
What he has to do.
Yeah. And it's also the thing about Khachikian's stars, that he introduced many future stars of Iranian cinema. For him, it was very simple. He was walking on the street, he was picking up people based on their resemblance to American stars. So he spotted Chanderman, who was in Anxiety, the bad guy of Anxiety, because he resembled Anthony Quinn. He picked up Sepernia because he resembled Clark Gable. And in fact, in the film, he resembled Clark Gable. As simple as that. So he wanted to create his own studio system within whatever was possible at that time, the limitations of the industry.
Yeah, he gathered every element of his films personally.
Yeah.
And many times producers says, no, who's this guy? He cannot play. But he say, I can train him. He had the expression, I can take acting from a little wood, something like that. And he did. Actually, the actings are not so modern, they're exaggerated. theatrical. But for those days, they were marvelous. They were fantastic.
Can we move on to the next, the next subject? Because this is also very interesting and concerns all of us. So when we decided to do this, the program, right? So okay, when you want to do a program on, video, okay, Harvard, you contact university, you get films, as simple as that. But here, the negotiations for this program, it was a process as complicated as nuclear deal. So it took a year, and then the prints arrived, and they had warned us about the prints, and the prints were not in good condition. So I would ask Mania, who was here during the process of digitizing at least 2 of the films, Anxiety and Strike. How did you find the prints and the condition they were in?
So, the prints arrived here in Mania Gregorian in order to be scanned, and actually they were not in a very good shape. But just a quick reminder that at the time we were talking with Behdad about it, at the time of the distributions, there were not so many copies made of them, and no one really cared about the negatives of them. So, so many movies made at that period of time. We don't know the whereabouts of the negative. We don't have a lot of so many good prints of them. And basically, those are the prints that went around, circulated, and were shown in the cinemas. Only the ones who would do well in the box office would go on and they would make duplications. So basically, the ones that we actually received here were survivors of those. You're seeing some of the images I chose for you. These are scanned ones. So we basically received the best we could have for these movies, and there were screening positives. They had a lot of issues of torn perforations since they had been played over and over, and they had to be rebuilt in order to pass through the scanning machine. There were a lot of tape joints, which is very damaging for the movies, and they had to be redone in the tape because there was no place to redo it by glue, and so they had to, all the splices had to be redone. Apart from the physical aspect of it, there are also some issues like the image quality that is actually showing how poorly the process of duplication was at the time. They have some focus issues. They have some like blurry. You see this double kind of thing. I don't know if I can.
Which one is the double one?
The lady with the phrase.
This one?
This one. This one. Yeah, it's not very clear, but you can see like it goes a little bit blurry. It's actually very visible if you play with the frame before and after. As you saw, there are some torn frames with emulsion completely taken off. There are some of very heavy scratches caused by the screenings of them. So the films were repaired by my colleagues patiently. All of the splices were redone. It was scanned, 2K scan, and there was very light lighting applied to that in order for it to be digitally processed and make a DCP out of it.
Yeah. So it's good to show you the heartbreaking effect.
Yeah, but this is the one with no emulsion left.
So, yeah, and so while working on the films, I spotted many different issues. First of all, for instance, the film we're going to screen tomorrow, I realized that this is an entirely different soundtrack. Then suddenly the soundtrack, even the voice of the actors changed, and then we came to the conclusion that the film was redone in the probably late 60s, early 70s for a redistribution, and it was probably supervised by Khachikian himself, but the voices are different from the old version. But there's a very worrying element about the whole program, and that's the missing scenes. There are missing frames, so I have identified 2 types of missing scenes and moments in Khachikian's films, which we're going to show you now. One is the obvious elements of time and wear and tear, and these films are not originals. They're projector positives. They're the only surviving elements. That makes sense. A few frames here, a few frames there, dropping. But then I have also realized that these films are systematically missing crucial scenes. By systematic, well, no kissing. There must be a kiss somewhere. There's no kissing, and I can't believe it. And there are a number of down scenes. Well, but let me put it this way. I have to be very tactful about it, okay? Because we don't want to offend anyone. We want to stay in good relationship with all film archives in the world. They say we have sent you the complete version, and yeah, the best they could for. I totally understand it, but someone, somehow, at some point, from 1979 up to now, has tampered with these films. I can show you a couple of examples. I can show you two clips. One, which is the natural wear and tear element, because there's nothing in the scene that they cut out. And the other one is a slightly different. So, sorry, can we play the first della clip? This is from, yeah, so anxiety, this is what we have scanned in Bologna. There's nothing, I mean, there's no reason for this scene to be cut out, so I guess this scene is lost. But the second one is a bit suspicious. Look at a scene from Anxiety, what we have scanned. Can we play the first strike Zabat clip, please? Whoever responsible for cutting this scene out is a criminal. It's a crime against crime cinema. But, so there is a pattern, and that's very worrying. But anyway, between, we have two choices. Not showing these films. Khachikian remain obscure forever, and eventually these films vanishing. And showing them with few missing scenes, so they're great enough to enjoy and to recommend. So we have 5 minutes left. Kave, would you, I don't know what we can say in 5 minutes, but I think I'll leave it to you to wrap this thing up about Khachikian. Any way you can encourage people to go and see the films at Cinema Ritrovato?
I'm not sure I know what to say other than I hope that all this provides some context for that. Yeah. Does anybody else want to say?
Well, let me rephrase my question. Why were you interested in Khachikian when we started this discussion a year ago? Why Khachikian?
Right. I think seeing. I mean, this program I think provides a context for Iranian cinema that isn't in existence on the festival circuit. And I think, looking at these films, I mean, you're seeing the films of a particular director, which is important, and a hugely influential director, a director who had as many of his assistants, people who would go on to make foundational films of the later generation, the new wave. But you're also seeing a window into an industry in the middle of the century that is not as familiar, I think, on this kind of festival circuit. And I think a lot of what oftentimes these festival programs you have to be careful of is taking a program of films and sort of extracting them from the context and saying, okay, these are the cut flowers that are not representative of an incoherent industry, but they're sort of special examples, and let's take them and put them in a bouquet with other cut flowers. And I think it's important to kind of push back on that and say, well, these shouldn't be seen extracted from that context, but should provide us some sort of access to the context that maybe was invisible or was difficult to see before. So hopefully, when you see these, you see them not as necessarily, as the work of a particular director, a brilliant director, but also as a way to sort of rethink what was happening in Iranian cinema in the 1950s, if you had any idea of what was happening in Iranian cinema in the 1950s. So I guess that's what I'm
So the time of this panel was limited, but we will be around if you wanted an informal discussion, and you can come to the films. We're always available, and we'd love to talk about Khachikian cinema. We have a small surprise for you as the finale of the panel, and this is a minute footage from an unfinished documentary about Khachikian, which features an interview with the maestro, of course, in probably from early 90s, probably 1992. It's a documentary which was meant to be directed by Ali Jakan. And it's interesting, I'm showing it so you can see the man, that's the reason. Otherwise, it kind of reminds me about the stereotypes with which people approach Khachikian. It's extremely typical, and the question is extremely, extremely typical. And the whole scene is like a moment from this documentary, French television documentary in the early 60s from the series Cinéaste Morton about the interview with Alfred Hitchcock. So there's no imagination here, but at least you can see siamo Khachikian in action. So thank you so much, and enjoy this clip. Sarah?
آقای خاچیکیان، تعریف شما از سینمای دلخوره و تفاوت آن با واقع‌گویی در سینما چیست؟
هنرهای نمایشی و دراماتیک بایستی بگم که در هر صورت هر دو عامل خدمت هیجان، ایجاد هیجانیه که به کار برده میشه. البته به شرطی که این هیجانی که ایجاد میشه هیجان کاذب نباشه و من شدیداً با این نوع مخالفم. و اما فرق که مطرح شد بایستی بگم که اصولاً هیجان یک جنبه‌ای داره که تماشاچی رو دلهوره، منظورم اینه که دلهوره جنبه‌ای داره که درش مسئله فضاسازی و لحظه‌زایی مطرحه برای جلب توجه تماشاچی و رسوندن به اونجایی که به اصطلاح میگن نفسگیر بودن. ولی غافلگیری یک جنبه بیشتر پیش‌بینی نشده و غیر مترقبه داره که ایجاد ترس میکنه. ولی با این یکی مورد من زیاد موافق نیستم و در فیلم‌های ما خیلی کم استفاده کردم. ولی ایجاد دلهوره بیشتر به من نزدیکه و من اتفاقاً میتونم بگم که برای این مدیون تماشاچی خودم هستم. همیشه فیلمایی که ساختم تو این مایه ها، تو این روال، شب اول همیشه من
See you later at the screening of the Crossroads.